All right, welcome back to the listener's commentary on 1 Corinthians. In this session, we're going to be looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 11, verses 2 through 16. And one of the things that's just a fact about 1 Corinthians is it's dealing with a whole host of questions and topics and issues that were really either troubling the Corinthian church in some way or causing divisions in the church in some way or things they didn't understand. In other words, we're reading a letter to the Corinthians about things that they didn't understand or problems that they were struggling with. And that is certainly the case here in 1 Corinthians 11, 2 through 16. If you look at the overview chart of the book of 1 Corinthians that's available inside the study hub, you'll see that chapter 11 begins the next main section in the letter. So the letter really has just a handful of sections that revolve around kind of big categories of topics. At least that's the way I prefer to break it down. So chapters 1 through 4, issues of division, wisdom, and the cross, and how the cross speaks into all of that. Chapters 5 through 7 are issues of immorality, sexuality, and marriage. The section we just wrapped up, chapters 8 through 10, revolves around meat offered to idols and how do we handle our freedom in that in a responsible way. Now here in chapter 11, picking up in verse 2, we begin the fourth major section of the letter, and that major section deals with issues related to what we in our day and age might call church services. That is, gatherings of the whole church, the public gatherings of the whole church. And this section goes from chapter 11 all the way through chapter 14. And I've titled it on that chart there in the study hub, that issues of order and propriety in Christian worship. And there are three issues primarily. You could break it down a little more than that, but primarily three issues that Paul is going to address in chapters 11 through 14. The one that takes up the majority of the space is chapters 12 through 14, and that is the question of spiritual gifts and love, and specifically speaking in tongues in chapter 14. So that's 12 through 14. But here in chapter 11, there are two initial issues he tackles about public worship before getting to the issue of spiritual gifts in public worship. And those two issues are this. The first, the one we'll look at in this recording, verses 2 through 16, has to do with head coverings in worship. It's actually a subject that Paul says he praises them for. The second subject, the second issue here in chapter 11 is verses 17 through 34, and that has to do with really serious breach of unity and fellowship during the Lord's Supper. And that's a subject that Paul says, there's no way I could praise you for that. And so these two topics Paul's going to address in chapter 11. We'll take up the first one here. And Paul notes in verse 18 that he's heard about these subjects. In other words, it's not things that the Corinthians wrote about, but that he heard about. And in this session, we're going to look at that first one, head coverings in the large group gathering for worship. And let me just say at the outset that this is actually a very challenging passage. The whole passage in particular is challenging, but particularly just some specific lines within it. There's a lot of scholarly debate about some of the things Paul says here, but there's also a lot of consensus about the basics of what's being said. In fact, most of the debate revolves around not what's being said per se, although, like I said, some lines are really challenging. Much of the debate revolves around, well, what are the implications for today? What is the meaning for today? How do we apply that today? What does that suggest about this today, right? So the debate revolves around trying to understand what was said in the original context with a view towards, well, how does that speak to us today? And so the topic, head coverings in public worship, particularly while praying and prophesying in public worship. And guess what? Even though there's some scholarly debate today, the original purpose and the original application is 100% clear. That's what I find so funny. There's a lot of debate about this text, but to the Corinthians, no debate. They knew exactly what Paul wanted them to do. He's clarifying for them a universal practice in his churches. Paul says that this is the tradition I pass on in all the churches. I praise you for this. And so he's clarifying for them that how are men and women supposed to handle the issue of head coverings in worship. I think it's important to point out that Paul actually gives instructions to both men and women here, because sometimes this text has been misheard and misused to speak only to women. It's not speaking only to women. It's speaking to men and women about head coverings when prophesying or praying in public worship. So there's instructions to both. And what does Paul expect the men in the church at Corinth to do? Well, it's very clear. Don't wear a head covering when praying or prophesying in the large group gathering in church. So men, no head covering. What about the women? What does Paul expect the women in the church at Corinth to do? Well, Paul expects them, when praying or prophesying in church, to wear a head covering. The first thing to note is this. Paul just assumes that some of the women in Corinth were going to pray and prophesy as part of the public gathering. He assumes that. Just like he assumes the men are going to do that. And then he gives instructions on the head covering thing in relationship to that. So, while there are some legitimate questions and debates about some of what's said here and some of the lines that are said here, the basic instruction for the church at Corinth is actually just that clear. Men, no head coverings. Women, head coverings when you're praying and prophesying in worship. And it actually seems like most of the church is doing what Paul wants them to do quite well. But there's a few maybe who are not, or pushing the edge, or who are raising a little bit of contentiousness about this. And so the purpose of this paragraph in this letter is simply to affirm the church that they actually got this one right, and to encourage the few who aren't doing this, that here's what Paul teaches in all the churches, and I want you to kind of get on board with it. So with that in mind, Paul says in chapter 11, verse 2, "Now, I praise you, that is, I affirm you, because you remember me in everything, and you hold firmly to the traditions, just as I handed them down to you." And then he has the specific head covering tradition in mind. He's actually going to end this passage in verse 16 by saying, "This is the tradition I pass on in all my churches." So he affirms them on this subject. They've got this right. I praise you. That was actually a customary way in ancient letters of affirming and reinforcing positive behavior. They could affirm somebody, praise them if they were doing something right. They would blame them if they were not doing it right. And so here we have praise. He's affirming them and reinforcing positive behavior. In fact, the whole tone of this paragraph is affirming and explaining, not rebuking. At the end, in verse 16, he simply mentions that if there's anyone who wants to be contentious about his instruction here, well, this is what he teaches everywhere, and he'll deal with it when he comes, all right? So he's affirming them and establishing the positive nature about what he's about to say about head coverings. So with that affirmation in mind, Paul writes, verse 3, "But I want you to understand that Christ is the head of every man, and the man is the head of a woman, and God is the head of Christ." Paul is actually going to use the word head in two senses in this paragraph. In this verse, we get one of the senses, that is, in more of a metaphorical sense, about the relationship between various people. The other sense is for the literal head on your body. So we have to pay attention for the two senses of head in this paragraph, the literal head on your body or relationship between various people. That's the way he's using it here for that relationship. And some have contended that we should hear the word head here to mean source, as in like source of a river, and that it has no connotation of authority or anything like that. Again, that's glancing in the direction of our society and trying to say, well, what are the implications for our world? But there's very little, if any, evidence that the word head, when used for relationships and metaphorically for relationships like this, that it ever meant source. Even the idea of source of a river, like head of the river, is meaning the uppermost part of a thing. It's still a literal use of it, just as the head of the body is the uppermost part of the body. It's not a metaphorical use describing a relationship between people. And so there's very little evidence that the word head ever meant source when used like this for relationship between people. There's virtually none. And in fact, in this verse, just try to read it with the word source in place of head, and you'll see it doesn't work. Christ is the source of every man. Like, what would that mean? I suppose you could say, well, he's the creator. Okay, maybe so. And the man is the source of a woman. or maybe wife, since the word gunaikos in Greek is, one word, gune, for woman or for wife. They didn't have a different word for that. So the man is the source of a woman, or the man is the source of a wife. That doesn't make any sense. There's no way you could say that. In fact, in verse 12, Paul actually is going to disagree with that in the very paragraph here, that that's not the way it works. And so Paul's actually going to counter that whole idea in verse 12. And then God is the source of Christ. Well, what would that even mean? In the Greek world of Paul's day, head was used like this in relationships just to describe roles of authority in relationships. Not essence, not value, just roles of authority in relationships. That's just the way the word was used all throughout the Greek-speaking world of Paul's day, whether we like it or not. That's just the way the word was used. So for the purpose of what Paul is going to say about head coverings, Paul has specified Christ is the head, that is, his role is the authority over the man. A man has the relationship of authority to a woman, or maybe better, wife, probably wife here. And God has authority in relationship to Christ, over Christ. Just read the Gospels, and that's clear. Jesus says he only does what his Father tells him to do, which actually, that line helps us see that being in a relationship where there are degrees of authority and roles of authority isn't a bad thing and doesn't minimize value. Like, Jesus clearly had value. Jesus clearly had authority. But he was also under God's authority, and he didn't see it as a bad thing. He actually saw it as a good thing, that he always did what his Father told him to do. So it's our personal, in our cultural context, it's our problem, not their problem, not the Bible's problem, this whole idea. We have sometimes misused those roles. That has created some problems. Now, having specified those relationships, Paul now explains head coverings in relationship to this. So he says in verse 4, every man who has something on his head while praying or prophesying in public worship disgraces his head. That's where we get the two senses of head. So you get the literal head, something on his head. That's the literal head. Should be uncovered. Don't put something on it, because if you put something on it, you disgrace your head. What's the second use of head here? Well, that's Christ. Christ is the head of every man. So a man who has a head covering on while praying or prophesying in public worship disgraces or shames his head. That is, he shames and disgraces his relationship to Christ, his Lord. But every woman, verse 5, who has her head uncovered while praying or prophesying disgraces her head. So again, she doesn't have something on her literal physical head. She disgraces her head, probably her husband that we've talked about, that the man, the husband, is the head of the wife. And both man and woman here seem to speak of husband and wife. And so failure to cover her head reflects badly on her marriage and her husband in their cultural context. Now, again, there's cultural assumptions and cultural conventions being dealt with all through this text that we may struggle to understand the assumptions and the conventions. Just have to remember, we're entering into a time machine and reading about a foreign culture from a long time ago. And Paul says that to not have her head covered while praying or prophesying in worship disgraces her husband. So that's the main point. But also notice, Paul just assumes that she might pray or prophesy in public worship. So Paul Gardner says this, one commentator says, wives are to worship in prayer and prophesying just as men do, but they are to do so in a way that continues to reflect to all onlookers their love and their honor for their husband. Now, the background of this is the head covering conventions in Roman Corinth. And that wasn't necessarily like a modern hijab or burqa or something like that. From engravings or paintings or other images from the time, we can get a pretty clear idea what is meant by the head covering. It's almost like a hood. It was part of the garment, the outer garment, which could be pulled up over the head in a moment for a variety of reasons. The problem here in this text is we don't know exactly what use of that hood, that covering, motivated Paul to to say what he says here. Like, what practice was influencing the Corinthians, and what practice was Paul wanting to either be in sync with or maybe be distinct from in the Greco-Roman world so that he passed it on to all his churches. We're just not totally sure about that. In fact, this is one of those times where the Corinthians knew exactly what Paul was addressing, and we don't. And that reminds us that we're reading someone else's mail. For example, we know that sometimes high-ranking Roman men could serve as a priest in a temple. And when they did the sacrifice part of the service, they would actually pull their hood up over their head. So does Paul bring this up because he wants to distinguish Christian worship from pagan worship? Or could it be that the head covering in such a setting was a symbol of status? Because it seems like that from what we can tell. And Paul didn't want such elitist status symbols to divide the church along the lines of wealth and social standing. Maybe. There's also some evidence that when women covered their head, that was viewed as an expression of modesty and chastity. And women who didn't have their head covered in public gatherings and when they were publicly presenting themselves were seen as lacking both modesty and chastity. There's evidence at this time in the Roman Empire that there was a move among some high-ranking Roman women to not cover their head, to kind of mark their independence and their status and their freedom. Is Paul wanting women to cover their head to say, no, we're not like that. We're not going to flaunt that. So there's definitely some cultural conditions and cultural customs that Paul is addressing by passing on the head covering practice to all his churches the way he does. We're just a far bit removed historically to totally know exactly what lies behind what Paul says. But based on what he says in this text, and based on what we know from history, it seems like gender expression, sexual propriety, and status seeking seem to be important to what he says. All right, so let's return back to the passage then and work our way down through it. So in verses 4 and 5, Paul tells the Corinthians exactly what he wants them to do when praying or prophesying in public worship. Men, no head covering. Women, head covering when praying or prophesying. Then he gives a reason for that. He says this, after he tells the women, cover your head when praying or prophesying, or else you bring shame on your husband, your head, for it is one and the same as the woman whose head is shaved. For if a woman doesn't cover her head, have her also cut off her hair. However, if it's disgraceful for a woman to have her hair cut off and her head shaved, well, then have her cover her head. Notice, again, cultural assumptions, cultural conditions. He's assuming correctly in their culture that to have their hair cut off or their head even shaved is disgraceful, and having their head uncovered without the hood pulled up over it when praying or prophesying would communicate really the same sort of thing that having a head shaved would. So what's the deal with hair cut off or head shaved? Well, in their culture, a shaved head was a sign of shame on a woman, and there's some evidence that it was actually used as a punishment for adultery. Sometimes maybe even used for just other forms of sexual impropriety. And in fact, Craig Keener, in his background commentary, contends that a woman with a shaved head or cut off hair was the greatest bodily shame that a woman could endure in their culture. Like visible bodily feature. In other words, a shaved head communicated shame, it seems like most likely because of sexual impropriety, which fits the notion that a covered head displayed modesty and chastity, and an uncovered head the opposite. And Paul's point thus seems to be that those women who were leaving their head uncovered in public worship when praying and prophesying up in front, like drawing attention to themselves, were not expressing their gender in an appropriate way, but were expressing immodesty and that they were sexually loose. That's what Paul seems to be saying by these cultural assumptions based on what we can tell from the cultural context. Then Paul explains this more in the following verses, and this is actually where things get a little confusing. All this other stuff's pretty clear from their culture. But beginning in verse 7, things get a little confusing. Paul says this in verse 7, "For a man should not have his head covered, since he's the image and glory of God. But a woman is the glory of man. And the implication is, and thus that's why she should have her head covered. What's Paul getting at here? Well, again, it's a little confusing, but it seems like in verses 7 and 8, Paul is reflecting the creation order that's found in Genesis, particularly in Genesis chapter 2. Now, in Genesis and in Paul's writings elsewhere and in the entire Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, and the New Testament, like Paul, the whole Bible, Genesis, everything understands that when God made humans, he made them male and female, and he made them both in his image. Therefore, whatever Paul means in verse 7, it cannot, in fact, mean that men are in the image of God and women are not. That he just can't mean that. Paul knows his theology. Paul communicates his theology about that elsewhere. So, again, what Paul seems to be doing is building his case off of the creation order, especially as portrayed in Genesis chapter 2. In Genesis chapter 2, God first made the male, but then noted the male didn't have a complement partner. So he was alone, and that wasn't good. So in Genesis 2, God made the woman from the man to be united with him, and thus together to reflect the unity and the otherness found in God himself. The two shall be one, just like God is 3 in 1, right? That's what happens in Genesis chapter 2. Paul here seems to be reflecting that in what he says. Also, the word glory here has to mean something like honor. When you look down at verses 14 and 15 of this paragraph, Paul uses the word glory in the same paragraph in contrast to the word honor. And so it seems to mean dishonor and glory are contrasted. So dishonor means one thing, glory means something like honor. So in view of all of that, it seems to be connected to the creation order and call the men and the women in the church when praying or prophesying to honor the creation order. How should they do that? Well, the man was created directly by God, so he must honor him by not wearing a head covering. The woman was created out of the man, so she must honor him, her husband, by wearing a head covering. That seems to be the point of verse 7. And in fact, Paul goes on in verse 8 to make it clear that he's basing this off of the creation order found in Genesis 2. And in doing so, he makes 2 points in verse 8. Here's the points he's going to make before we read it, just so you know what to listen for. The woman was made from man, and the woman was made on account of the man. I'll explain that a little bit more when we get there. Look what he says in verses 8 and 9. He says, "For man does not originate from woman, but woman from man." That's the first point. The man doesn't originate from woman, but woman from man. In other words, the woman was made from man. That's Genesis 2, right? And notice here in verse 8 that it begins with "for." He's giving a rationale. He's explaining, giving a basis for what he says. So Paul now bases the different gender expressions with regard to head coverings in public worship. He bases that on the order of creation in Genesis 2. This particular cultural expression regarding head coverings is grounded in the creational difference between male and female as seen in what happens in Genesis 2 with the order of creation of man and woman. Man was created directly by God. Woman was created out of man. Now, verse 9 continues, "For," again, giving further explanation and grounding. "For, indeed, man was not created for the woman's sake, but the woman for the man's sake." Now, that could be really like, what are you getting at, Paul? Are you saying that the woman was made, to serve the man, to be his little whatever, right? I think that's a confusion in my mind from the translation. The word "for the sake of" in Greek is the preposition dia plus the accusative. And you could translate it "for the sake of." If you translate "for the sake of," that is the idea of purposive. That would mean that the woman was made for the purpose of the man, which makes it sound like she was created to do his bidding, to meet his need. She exists for whatever he wants. That's not what Genesis 2 says. So I don't think that translation is helpful. The more typical way dia plus the accusative is used is to mean "on account of." In other words, it gives the cause or the reason a woman was made. The woman was made because of the man. In other words, he was the cause of her creation. And in the Genesis 2 account, that's clearly the case. He was deficient without her. God's made man and then says it's not good for him to be all by himself. It's not good for the man to be alone. He needs a suitable helper, which means a complement. And don't get bothered in Genesis 2 by the word helper. The most common way that word is used in the Old Testament is actually for God himself. It's not a demeaning term. It's actually a very noble term. God is our helper, right? And so man's all by himself. He needs somebody to come alongside of him so that together they can fulfill their God-designed purpose. So it's in this way that a woman, or probably better again, wife, is the glory or the honor of a man or husband. She was made to help him be all that God created him to be because he couldn't do it without her. It wasn't good for him to be alone. So together, as male and female, they image God back into the world. And now, with that, based on the order of Genesis 2, Paul says in verse 10, therefore, the woman, back in Corinth, back in public worship, therefore the woman should have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. More confusing stuff. Literally, this reads, the woman ought to have authority upon or over her head on account of the angels. Some have suggested that authority upon or authority over her head is the idea that she should have freedom to make her own decision in this matter. Not so sure that fits the context, though. Most translations, therefore, supply the word sign or symbol to help us understand what's being gotten at, that the head covering is a sign or a symbol of authority on her head. That's what the head covering is. Anthony Thistleton, in his commentary, notes that the verb translated to have, the woman should have, often means to hold or to keep, and that the word authority plus the preposition upon, authority upon, or authority over can mean control of. So he suggests translating it something like that the woman should keep control over her head. And the idea being, don't forgo your head covering just to assert your freedom. Just like don't eat meat in temples, right, to display your freedom. You got to think about the impact on other people. So in the same sort of way, control yourself with regard to your head covering. You need to respect the marks of respectable womanhood in your culture. And in their culture, the symbol of being a respectful woman, particularly a wife who was under the authority of her husband and who was sexually pure in relationship to all that, the symbol of that was a head covering. And she could go anywhere in security and with profound honor and respect if she wore that in their culture. So he's saying, don't forgo that, but have some self-control and give up whatever freedom you think you might have, just like with the temple meat thing, right? Give up your freedom and honor this. And then he says, because of the angels. And no one's really sure what Paul means by that. Like, no one. There's a lot of different options out there. Let me just list off some of the options. I'm going to do it real quick because we're just not sure what Paul means. Some say, oh, this is in reference to the fallen angels from Genesis chapter 6 who lusted after women and everything went bad. So put the head covering on because in some sense it'll protect you from these fallen angels. Some say it's that the angels, are gathered in worship when Christians gather in worship. And so to honor the angels, let's have proper order in worship. Some say that related to that, in some Jewish traditions, angels were viewed as guardians of order. This is a mark of order, wear the head covering just to honor the order. Some come back to the idea of fallen angels and say that this refers to the fallen angels who currently rule the nations, but someday will be judged by believers. And therefore, because of that, you need to have this authority upon your head. No one really knows what Paul is meaning here by that, so we just need to be honest about that. But what Paul does next from there is he qualifies what he's just said. So he's given the order of creation. He's said that in view of the order of creation, women should wear their head covering to honor their husband. And then he qualifies that in what he says going forward by pointing out that men and women are dependent on each other, and both are dependent on God. So in the Lord, in Christ, there's mutuality between men and women. Look what he says, verse 11. However, or maybe better, nevertheless. This is a shift. Nevertheless. So here's the order. Have that head covering. Women, men, don't put the head covering on. We need to honor the way things were created. We need to honor that. Nevertheless, in the Lord, neither is woman independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. For as the woman originated from the man, so also the man has his birth through the woman, and all things originate from God. So there's the order, and a woman should wear the head covering to honor her husband because she came from man. But guess what? Neither is independent of each other. This qualification ensures that we shouldn't misread what Paul said in verses 7 through 10 as suggesting that somehow men are more important, men are superior, and women depend on men, and not vice versa, right? We should not misread it that way. Just because there's an established order by virtue of creation, and that is properly expressed in the head covering conventions, doesn't mean there's any inferiority and superiority. It doesn't mean that there isn't any mutuality and equality. There is mutuality and equality. Literally, the sentence reads, nevertheless, neither is woman without man or man without woman in the Lord. The New American Standard here translates without as independent of. But the idea really is apart from, and it communicates the idea that men and women are mutually dependent on each other. They don't exist apart from each other, and they need each other. And guess what? They both need God. They all derive their existence and their well-being from God. And so there is mutual interdependence here. And this is intended to make sure that even though gender distinction is important, even in conventions like head coverings in their culture, such distinctions and difference doesn't imply superiority or inferiority. In the Lord, as part of his people, there is mutuality, equality, and interdependence between the two. So women don't exist apart from men don't exist apart from women, and both of them owe their existence to God. Then he returns to the main point and restates what he expects of them to do with a final appeal to what is appropriate. Just what is in good taste in their culture. So he says in verse 13, judge for yourselves. Is it proper? That word proper means polite, seemly, appropriate, in good taste. Is it in good taste for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered in the public assembly? Not just in general, where, again, the context here is in the public assembly. So, is it in good taste for a woman to pray in the public assembly with her head uncovered? And the implied answer is, he expects them, like, you guys know, you guys are smart, figure it out. And the answer is, well, no, it really isn't in good taste. So, then he asks one final rhetorical question to drive his point home. Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man has long hair, it's a dishonor to him, but if a woman has long hair, it's a glory to her? For her hair is given to her as a covering. So her hair is like a natural covering, right? It's sort of like that. And doesn't nature itself teach you that long hair for a man, dishonor, but long hair for a woman, glory? Now, we have to be clear. Don't push Paul's language too far. He's speaking generally here. Paul knows about the Nazirite vow, for example, from the Old Testament. Paul knows the story of Samson. He knows that sometimes it is honorable for men to have long hair, that there's stories of a biblical hero who has long hair. He knows in their own Greco-Roman culture, he knows there's exceptions in Greek culture, even in Greek history. For example, the Spartans who marked themselves out with their long hair. He knows all this. But in their world, generally speaking, and really throughout most of the world, throughout history, generally speaking, there's a long-established convention of women wearing longer hair than men. There's exceptions, but generally speaking, that has been a long-established convention throughout their world and throughout most of the world throughout history. So when Paul says, even nature teaches us this, that's what he's referring to, this long-established general convention around the world. So just as long hair is like a natural covering and thus an honor to her, so too the head covering convention, while praying or prophesying in the gathering of believers, is an honor. Let's treat it with honor. And then he says in verse 16, to wrap it up, but if anyone is inclined to be contentious about this, we have no other such practice, nor do the churches of God. This is just the general tradition and practice in the church. All right, now, Let's wrap this up with this question. What do we even do with this passage? Well, that's what my daughter asked me when I told her I was working on this section. What do we even do with that passage, Dad? And it's a fair question. This is one of those places that reminds us that the Bible wasn't written to us. Yes, it was written for us as God's word, but it wasn't written to us. We're reading somebody else's mail. So what do you do with a text that is clearly addressing conventions and concerns that may not be ours? And that's the question of application. And when we're dealing with application, I address this actually more fully in the Bible Study Skills course that's inside the Study Hub. And so I talk about all of this a little more deeply there. But when you're dealing with application, the first thing we need to do is try to hear and understand the text in its original context. Make sure we've heard it accurately and rightly. Then we can figure out what to do with it. And here, the original meaning and application is actually pretty clear. Because men and women are different based on creation, that needs to be expressed in the gender-appropriate manner regarding head coverings when praying or prophesying in public worship. What that means is men, no head coverings, women, head coverings. That's actually all pretty clear. And like I said, there would be no debate among the Corinthians among this, and Paul actually praises them for it because most of them have it. They would know exactly what to do with that. But for us, the situation is different. So then at that point, you look at the theological bedrock, or as I mentioned in the last recording, you could go up the ladder of abstraction. However you want to look at it, go down to the theological bedrock or go up the ladder of abstraction. Both are trying to get to the same idea, and that means what are the big, broad theological principles that are being applied specifically in their cultural context. And here it's that men and women are different, but they're interdependent, and they must express their God-designed gender in appropriate ways, including clothing, in public worship, when they're going to be visible in public worship. I would actually also say that should probably include being mindful of what the clothing they wear communicates about sexual propriety. Because remember the bit about the shaved head. Paul's concerned about sexual propriety. So if you're in a culture in which head covering conventions still exist and express maleness and femaleness as it did in Corinth, and honor and marriage as it did in Corinth, then guess what? Apply this passage straight across. But if not, well, then what does? What kind of clothing conventions and other conventions express propriety and sexual propriety and maleness and femaleness in appropriate ways, in ways that are in good taste and make sense? One commentator says head coverings probably aren't the issue in most Western societies. However, there are still ways in which men and women can flaunt their disdain for convention and for gender differentiation and thus draw attention to themselves rather than to the Lord and His created order. So we should be aware of that. N.T. Wright, commenting on this, says the underlying point then seems to be that in worship, it's important for both men and women to be their truly created selves, to honor God by being what they are and not blurring the lines by pretending to be something else. His main point, Wright goes on, is that in worship, men should follow the dress and hair codes which proclaim them to be male, and women should follow the codes which proclaim them to be female. And that seems to be really the theological heart of this text. And that we can apply straight across the board. All right, thanks for tuning into this session on the Listener's Commentary on 1 Corinthians. The Listener's Commentary is a crowd-funded Bible teaching ministry that's made possible by your generous support. So thanks a ton if you're one of those who helps this ministry exist and spread because of your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, you can do so by going to listenerscommentary.com, clicking the Give button, and that'll take you to a page where you can set up a monthly donation by putting in an amount and clicking the box that says, make this a monthly amount, or you can give a one-time donation by just putting an amount and clicking Give right there. So thanks a ton for your support.